do think a lot of people believed as we walked in that we must know, but we just had no clue.
Hi, I'm Jane.
Hello, I'm Susan Smith. I'm one of the co-directors of For Women Scotland, who recently took the Supreme Court action.
And I'm Bex.
And we are
Insightful Sisters.
Hi, everybody. We're really lucky tonight. We've got Susan Smith from For Women Scotland with us. When we started doing this podcast, we had an idea of promoting ordinary women that had got involved in this fight. And somehow you don't quite fit that, Susan. You're a rather extraordinary woman. So tell us a bit about you and the others. Tell us a bit about your personalities. Who are For Women Scotland?
So it's come down to the three of us now in For Women Scotland. Myself, Marion Calder and Trina Budge. Trina has a ferocious brain. I have to say she's one of the sharpest people I know, and she is a real details expert. So she goes through all the legislation. She picks out the bits that you can take to court and challenge and that might be relevant for various policies. She put me right on something the other day, which I was vastly relieved about. So she has been absolutely brilliant in bringing forward all this stuff for our court cases. And in fact, I think the lawyers feel that she could have taught them things. Marion is just a brilliant strategist. She's so good at thinking of big picture stuff and how to organise events or place news stories so that you get maximum impact at any one time. And she's thinking 3 steps ahead all the time about what we're going to do next. And then there's me, and I apparently have the good words, so I put a lot of this stuff into written form and send it round. But I do feel like I'm not as good sometimes as the two of them on some of that stuff, the other strategy and the detail work. But I think we've all definitely got our strengths, and we've said in the past that we all feel that we couldn't do the jobs that the other two do. So it's been a really good team that we've built. Purely accidentally, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy, is it, to work as a team sometimes? You've done things which I imagine behind the scenes are incredibly stressful, and you must at times, because you're all strong people, you must have wanted to put a different emphasis on or pull in different ways. I mean, how do you keep that team together and keep going?
Yeah, it can be hard. I think the big one was when we decided to take the second judicial review. Our first judicial review, we obviously lost in the first court. But our KC and our solicitor felt that really we had such a strong case because there is nothing in law that supports self-identification, and that was what the Scottish Government were arguing for at that point. But then when we went back to judicial review on the question of GRCs, that became much harder because I think the established view in the legal world at that time was that a GRC did change a person's sex for the purposes of the Equality Act. And it was only, I think, because Trina really went into the weeds on it and worked out that this rendered the functioning of the Equality Act impossible, and found the argument that there's a section that disapplies this change of sex for all purposes. And she persuaded Aidan that this was the case, so he said, no, we've got a case. But I think initially Marion and I were nervous about it because it's a big commitment. It's a huge commitment when you've got to spend hundreds of thousands of other people's money taking a court case which you might lose. I think in the end, after we'd gone around the houses on it and argued it all out and pros and cons, we thought, well, in fact, we'll be in a no worse a situation than we are if we lost that argument. And if it was established that GRCs changed a person's sex in law, we would at least have an answer, because up until then, we'd had this situation with what we call Schrödinger's GRC, that the Scottish Government, for example, were arguing that it made no difference to access to spaces when they were trying to reform the Act to allow anybody to just self-declare and get a piece of paper. But then we're arguing in court that, yes, it changed all your rights under the Act. So we thought, well, we need an answer. We need to know, because that will impact how governments look at these policies and these laws going forward. So we decided to risk it, but it was a massive decision, and we did have very long conversations about how we were going to do that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Who's the optimist? Who's amongst you is the persons saying, come on? Or you might be three optimists, I don't know.
I think it goes in cycles, and I think it depends on what we're looking at. And sometimes I feel positive that politicians are going to change, and they don't. I think Marion and Trina possibly felt more optimistic on the day of the ruling than I did. I think that's because I thought I was going to have to say something if we lost. So I was trying to get into the headspace of thinking, what do I say if we lose, rather than I'm going to prepare my celebratory speech. So I think there are times when we have to lift each other up. When we all go through periods where we think, what on earth is going on? And thankfully, I think they don't always coalesce. So often one of us is feeling more perky while somebody else is in the dumps. So we can chivvy each other on.
And of course, your name came from the fact that you were 4 women originally. So do you just want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what happened initially was that there was an organisation before For Women Scotland was born, Women's Spaces in Scotland, and that was started. There was a whole melee of groups that I think started back in sort of 2016 to 17 from the Mumsnet boards largely. That's where groups like Women's Place UK and Fair Play for Women came from, and this group came out of that as well in Scotland. In Scotland, there was consultation on the GRA, which closed before the one in England. And so this group was trying to raise awareness of that. And it was quite difficult because once the England and Wales one kicked in and there was more news reports, I think people got more of an idea of what was proposed. But in Scotland, back in 2017, 2018, there really wasn't a lot of noise. So they had organised a couple of meetings. There was one in Edinburgh, which was organised with Women's Place UK, and that was horribly protested by really noisy, violent activists. Very scary, very intimidating. Similarly, in Glasgow, there was one organised by them, and along with Let Women Speak, Venice Allen came up and helped. So they'd had these 2 meetings. There was a loose group of women, but then the consultation closed in March. And I think a lot of people at that point felt pretty low because it had largely been answered by the councils and the public bodies, but of course, hugely under the influence of the sort of trans lobby groups. And that was the main, we knew it was going to go very badly against women. So at that point, though, I think a lot of people thought, well, what's the point of continuing with this? Marion and Trina and Magdalene and her girlfriend Nicole had a bit of a crisis meeting in June of 2018 saying, no, we can't stop. We've got to keep going. They'd sort of been in touch through different channels and said, I think we should try and make an effort and get people back together and keep going. So they did that in June of 2018. They started then bringing on other people to the new group, and they did call themselves For Women Scotland in a little bit of an ironic, is it just going to be the 4 of us? Are we going to be able to persuade any of the others to come along and keep going? And of course they did. But yeah, the trans activists often think, they think they're being really funny. They go, there's only 4 of them. Yet that was the point. It was a joke. And I think then when we did the recent interviews and things like the Sunday Times, they went, there's actually only 3 of them. Why aren't they? Dear, they're so literal minded, and they really don't have any. They could read up and find out. What's this background? But no.
Although they might check Wikipedia, and I've checked your Wikipedia and it's really all wrong.
God, sometimes it gets tidied up, and then sometimes people come in. So that was then. There were a few more of us. By the end of the summer, we'd had a meeting, a little bit of a war council, and then of course Magdalene got sick again. And she wasn't able to do the sort of public facing stuff that she'd been going to do, because that was the idea of For Women Scotland, because the last organisation had met with civil servants and tried to meet with politicians, but people were very scared. I'm sure you can remember back in 2018, people were terrified often of putting their face to something or their name to something. So the idea of For Women Scotland was that we were going to have to be brave. And obviously that was a big thing for Magdalene. She always believed that the more people who stood up and put their face on something, it's harder to target everyone. So she'd encouraged that. And then I'd come on board, but I volunteered to take on some of the work, and that was really how I ended up being part of the.
Yeah. I mean, Magdalene is such a great loss, but it's lovely to think how appreciative she would have been as to what's happened, I'm sure.
I hope so.
I think so. I'm going to pass you across to Bex because we're getting into the history, and I know she'll tell me off if I don't let her ask her questions.
It's true. We punch each other behind the scenes, honestly, Susan. So we're in 2018 at the moment, and in Scotland we've got the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act, and on the outside it's almost a good thing for women because the whole premise of it is to increase the representation of women. And this is something that we've obviously, this discussion has happened across the UK, but can you take us to that place? And was there a moment where you realised, like, oh no, this is not what it seems?
Yeah, so that had actually gone through before For Women Scotland came into existence. And yes, on the face of it, it looks like wonderful equal representation for women. But what we now know is that a lot of these things, whenever things were going through the Scottish Parliament at this point, they were often being used as a sneaky backdoor vehicle for self-identification. And this was classic. And they'd had a lot of arguments about what they meant when they said representation for women. They initially said it was going to be aligned to the Equality Act, but Scottish Trans Alliance, who had and still have a lot of influence in policy making in Scotland, came in and basically wrote the definition they wanted, which was that anybody who self-identified as a woman and used female pronouns and all this sort of rubbish was a woman for the purposes of the bill. And nobody noticed that. I think when it passed in Parliament, that wasn't something that the SPs picked up because they weren't plugged into that. That had all been done at committee stage. And no one was really looking at it. So it had gone. And I think there was an article on the Fair Play for Women's site quite early in 2018 about how the word woman had been stolen. And it was something that Trina had picked up as well. And she was very angry about this bill. And when we formed, it was something she really wanted to do something about. But of course, there are strict rules about when you're out of time for challenging pieces of legislation. So it was worrying, and it was being cited by the time I came to give evidence on the census at the end of 2018. I remember Tim Hopkins coming in and saying, well, I think you should have the same sort of definition here as you've got in the Gender Representation on Public Boards, because that's passed, and so that's already there. That's on the statute books. Why wouldn't you have the same definition? So it was really being used as a vehicle to keep pushing. And it's really interesting now looking back because the bill hasn't actually achieved very much for women. The latest reports of public boards actually show that women's representation isn't as high as when they passed the Act in 2018. So I just feel it was never really there as a tool to do something to improve women's representation. Most of the impetus for this bill was coming from people who were pushing it to use it as some sort of self-ID vehicle.
I mean, that is a pretty shocking result, isn't it?
It is.
That the representation's actually gone down is a sign of failure, I would say.
Absolutely.
I mean, this whole story is very sort of David and Goliath because essentially you're taking on the Scottish government. And when you initially raised this challenge, I'm sure you couldn't have known that it would have gone right the way up to the Supreme Court. What was the moment where you decided, right, okay, yes, it needs to be us and we need to do this now?
Yeah, gosh, it was a long fight. But so, as I say, Trina had always had a bugbear about this. bill because, as I say, she is so good on the legislation, and she was saying we cannot allow this to stand. And then in 2020, the government decided to consult on the implementation of it. So it hadn't actually come into force at this point. So we asked the lawyers, I don't want to get too much into the technical details, but we went to the lawyers and we said, because it's not actually come into force, because they're consulting on it, does that mean that we are not out of time, as we feared we were? And could we take this challenge now? And it was a bit of a moot point, but a judge decided to allow us to. And so that was when we decided to give it a go. And it was scary. But we started the Crowd Justice fundraising. We didn't know what we were going to get, how far we were going to get with it, and went to the 2 Scottish courts on the first challenge, lost in the first one, which really should not have happened. And I think there was a large amount of emotional sway because Equality Network intervened at that point and put in a load of witness statements from people saying, but I would feel very sad if I couldn't be counted as a woman for the purposes of public boards, which was just ridiculous. And that was the court where they found for us and they said that provisions in favour of women, by definition, exclude biological males. And they said nothing at all about GRCs in that ruling because GRCs weren't even in play in that ruling. So we were absolutely thrilled and delighted.
Yeah.
And then at that point, the Scottish government they were told they had to quash the faulty definition of woman. So they came up with an alternative one. And one of the things we found out very quickly with judicial reviews is there is very little scope if you think that the person hasn't done, on the other side, the losing party hasn't done what they're supposed to do, unless it's really been properly court mandated, you have to go all the way back to the beginning and start again, which was what happened with us.
Oh, a nightmare. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we got that amazing quote. Initially, it was Lady Dorian, wasn't it? And she said, "You've conflated and confused 2 distinct categories of the Equality Act." And it seemed like in that moment, it was like, great. To me, that was about as clear as it can get.
Yeah. And she said there was no such thing in the Equality Act as a category called transgender women.
Yeah.
That there was a protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but that didn't count under sex. So yeah, we were absolutely thrilled with that. We thought this is pretty robust. But then those pesky GRCs raised their awkward little heads.
Yeah, well, it shows the sort of unending creativity of gender ideologists as they try to figure out a way. So tell us about that. So it then went on and went in their favour again. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So one of the reasons we decided to fight it, apart from, as I said earlier, about thinking, well, we're in no worse position, was that at the time, the Scottish government were also trying to reform the Gender Recognition Act. And they wanted to bring in a system where anybody could get a gender recognition certificate based purely on declaration. And they didn't have to provide any. They put in things like, it has to be living as a woman for 6 months or whatever rubbish. But there was absolutely no burden of proof on anybody. You just had to put your letter in. No diagnosis of gender dysphoria, nothing. I mean, all these things obviously raise points about whether those are grounds to allow anybody to have a gender recognition certificate in the first place. But this removed everything. And when we raised complaints, they had said to us that a gender recognition certificate did not affect anyone's right of access to services, spaces and provisions under the Equality Act. And this was the line I think they were being fed by Scottish Trans and so on. And it was a convincing line for some people because the area was fuzzy enough that nobody really knew what was happening. So the argument being put forward in the Scottish Parliament was that this was an admin measure. It was just about changing your birth certificate so you could get a marriage certificate in their words, correct gender. So you could get a death certificate, which I always found absolutely bizarre. And there was a moment when an SNP MSP stood up and said, imagine the pain of being buried in the wrong gender. And I thought, if I'm feeling pain while I'm being buried, I've got worse things to worry about. But this was the argument. It was pure admin. And then they went to court over the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act, saying that the category of women for equal representation included men who had a gender recognition certificate and excluded women who had a gender recognition certificate which changed their legal sex or certificated sex to male. So you can't hold these two opinions. This was ridiculous. You can't say that both these positions are correct because they had already lost the self-identification case. And I think that was really the standpoint that Scottish Trans were coming from. Their belief was that anybody who said they were a woman was entitled to go into a women's changing room or use a women-only service or stand for a public board. But we'd knocked that argument down. They were trying to argue it didn't make any difference whether you had a certificate or not because they were saying it was access all areas anyway. But once we'd won that argument, that couldn't logically be maintained. But of course, they did try to maintain it. So we thought, well, we have to go to court. We have to prove that when they say this, they don't actually believe it. It was a much harder fight. Obviously, we lost twice in the Scottish courts, and I think the decision to go to the Supreme Court was quite scary, but I think we sort of thought we can't go back now. There's no way we can go back. We need this once and for all. While it was really scary, I'm really glad we did it because I think that our first judicial review, even though we won it, even though it was really significant and it knocked down self-identification, because it was in a Scottish court, I don't think it had the same impact across the rest of the country. Whereas going to the Supreme Court made the front pages across the country and abroad, and it was something that everybody noticed. And a lot of the conversations that we're now hearing about the Supreme Court ruling, they're not about the Supreme Court ruling because the Supreme Court ruling was only about GRCs. A lot of the conversations now are on self-ID, which we'd already proved was unlawful, but we're now getting that into Westminster and into public spaces in the rest of the UK because we went all the way to the Supreme Court. So it was a good thing we did it, but it was quite scary.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been hugely scary. It's something where, I can imagine there was this moment of, oh God, do we give up at this stage? We've come this far. And as you say, you knew that you had to keep pushing. I mean, that's incredibly brave because Supreme Court, as we know, creates case law and the outcome of it, then has some effect on how the law is applied in other cases. It was a big risk if it hadn't gone our way.
But I mean, the Scottish courts do too, for Scotland, obviously, not necessarily for the rest of the UK, but they're persuasive. So if somebody had gone to the High Court, England and Wales, and they would have looked at the Scottish ruling. So we couldn't afford to let it stand for anybody.
So then let's go forward in time to 16th of April, was it not? 2025.
Was.
And women were tuning in from around the world. We know this. I mean, going in that day, did you sort of know already that it had gone your way? How were you feeling? What were you expecting?
So we didn't have a clue. And usually we were told we might have the ruling up to 5 days in advance because generally the Supreme Court will let people know the outcome a day, 2 days, a little bit ahead of time. And we got this message through, and the Scottish Government got the same, that it wasn't going to happen. And our lawyer went back and asked if it could even be an hour or half an hour just so we could prepare ourselves mentally for it. And they said no. I think they were so aware of how important and how significant it was and how many people were going to be watching and analysing it that they just did not want to risk the possibility of any leaks. So we were going down on Marion and I were going down on the train the day before, and we were getting calls from journalists saying, do you think you'll be able to do a few hundred words for publishing after the judgment? And I said, I don't know if I'll have time or how I'm going to arrange that, because there might be interviews and what have you. And some of them were saying, well, could you not just do it based on the draft ruling that you've got? I haven't got a draft ruling. And I thought, I can't even make up an all eventualities piece for each outcome, because there were so many different outcomes. You know, we could have won on everything. We could have won on some points. We could have lost on everything. We could have had a loss, but this needs to happen. So we said, I can't come up with something. I'm so sorry. But I do think a lot of people believed as we walked in that we must know. That was the morning of, we were trying to work out what we were going to do, what we were going to wear and things. And I think we sort of hedged a bit, because Marion put her black suit on and I put my bright green suit on. And I said, I'm going to look like a real tit if we come out and we've lost and I'm standing here like shining beacon. So, but we just had no clue. So going in, and also when they were taking pictures of us going in, and they said, can you stop and take a picture? And I was thinking, do we smile? Because if we smile and then we come out and we've lost, we're also going to look a bit stupid. Yes, sitting in that court was, because we had to be very well behaved, quiet. I wasn't taking a lot of it in. It was, I think, when Lord Hodge said sex had to be biological, it was the view of the court that sex meant biological sex. And Marion and I looked at each other and grabbed hands. And then you could see we both had the same thought. We thought, there's a but coming, so we'll tamper it down. And it wasn't until he started getting into the list of reasons. And there were some of the women from the lesbian interveners behind us, and they're all going, patting us on the back. Yay! Behind, thumbs up. And I still couldn't quite process it until right at the end when he said that they allowed the appeal. And then we all stood up, very polite, quiet. They walked out, and then everybody started shouting and clapping and crying. So I got a bit of FOMO watching the Edinburgh film back later, because there were obviously all the women in Scotland there with Trina, and they were able to clap and cheer as he was reading it. We couldn't do that.
I mean, I think a lot of women at the time were saying similar, that it was so early that he announced the ruling that it was like, is that it? Oh my God, is that it? And then as it was going on, just sort of that slow dawning realization. I cannot imagine it after such a lengthy battle. And Jane, in a moment, will sort of look at how things have played out since. But I suppose, just for our listeners, in that moment and in that day, what was that ruling and what did it mean?
It meant the world. You know, it was, and every point that he went through, we thought that they've got it. They've really got it. They've understood. They have gone through the act and they have realised that you cannot have this mixed sex category of women. And it was so beautifully set out and it was so clear. And I remember later with a group of other people, and Naomi Cunningham was going through it, and she said, this is brilliant. It's got everything. I think, you know, that day was just extraordinary. It's seared onto my memory. And I have never seen so many photographers and press in my life as when we walked out of that courtroom. And I still find it quite hard to process how much attention was on that. And at that point, you know, there was pure happiness, because I think we thought, well, we've done it. We've won it. And then, of course, everyone starts being difficult. So took some of the joy out of it. You know, the fact remains we did win it. We did win it. It stands. And for all that people are trying to mess it up and making us keep fighting, nothing's going to take that away now.
No, I mean, it was an incredible moment. It's amazing, and it's also strange that it felt so amazing because we're 50% of the population, and we shouldn't be so bowled away that we're just seen, that we're just sort of recognised as we are.
I know. And I think the thing that, for me, that was so important, and the reason we had to do it, is that I think the other side of the argument has been one that thrives in the shadows and with the whataboutery clauses and the obfuscation. And this just laid it all out very clearly. And I think one of the advantages that we had was that the Scottish Government and the lobbyists completely overreached, because they put it explicitly into law, which hadn't really been done up until that point. There was nothing else I can think of where it says women includes men who identify as women, or women includes men who have a GRC. Don't think anybody had spelt it out. So because they spelt it out, we could actually go for it. They'd relied on being able to go in and say, when that says woman in that policy or that piece of legislation, what it means is. And there was nothing concrete, I think, to hang a legal challenge off. And so, I always say thank you, Scottish Government, for putting it in writing.
I'm sure they appreciate your thanks. Right, I will pass you on to Jane to look into what happened next.
Yeah, I almost want to stop there, really.
Wouldn't that be nice? Just sunshine, victory, arms raised.
It was such a great day. So since then, you've been pretty busy, haven't you?
Yes.
So initially, there was some things happened quite quickly. I remember Barclays changed their policy, didn't they? And up in Scotland, I think Police Scotland. Do you want to tell us about some of the good things that happened initially?
Yeah, so initially, people read the ruling and understood it because it's pretty clear. So yes, we had organisations like Barclays made a very swift change. The Police Scotland, the prisons, actually at that point, they put the men in Scotland, they put the male prisoners who were in the female estate into sort of lockdown onto a rule. So they were taken out of the general female population at that point. The Scottish Parliament itself moved swiftly to redesignate the toilets in the Holyrood building. So it was starting to move. And then, of course, we got the protests and people saying, you're not going to stop me using the toilet, and barricading themselves in the doors. And then you got people like Jolyon Mormon, the Good Law Project, just lying about. And we've now got to a point, I think, where I feel like it's Groundhog Day, because we're now at the point where you hear someone like Bridget Phillipson coming into court and saying, oh, well, it's on a case-by-case basis. Well, that was exactly where we were 8 years ago, and that's what we said. No, it's not on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, we're in a better situation because we have the ruling, but it's quite extraordinary that after that initial push from organisations, the resistance came back and the same old arguments started to be recycled, and trying to claim that you could, make the case for an individual man to be allowed in the changing room. It's quite extraordinary that it didn't move further than it did, and it should have done, and that we're now having to keep going back to court to push some of these companies and public bodies to accept it. For example, in Edinburgh, the council got legal advice, and they said we cannot have mixed-sex toilets in schools. We have to have the male-female, and then we could have maybe some self-contained gender-neutral ones. And they moved to do that. But other councils have not. So we're in this weird no man's land, and everyone's waiting for the EHRC code because they've convinced themselves that that's the point at which the law is applied, rather than the point at which the Supreme Court handed down the ruling.
And the Scottish Government quite early on set up this, what did they call it, a short-term working party?
Short-term working group. That's no longer short-term.
Not really, no. Or working.
They were talking about it today in committee. The minister was giving evidence, and I don't think they are working. I think they're flicking crumbs at each other with rulers and pushing their pens around, because there's very little evidence that they've been doing anything. And when she was asked what they'd done, the thing that ministers always keep coming back on is they say, well, we've changed the guidance on the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act. That is the least amount of work you could do. That was what you had to do, you were forced to do, because that was the piece of legislation we challenged. But they changed a bit in the schools guidance. It's still a bit of a mess, but they have got to a point where they're sort of okay on law on the changing room toilet situation. So we've accepted that, really, that part of it, even though there are other areas where we are not happy with them. But they have done the bare minimum. And of course, they're now fighting us on prisons. I don't know what the short-term, now long-term working group has thought about on prisons, but I don't know what they've reported back, or if they've reported back. They don't seem to have met with the EHRC. It's an excuse for procrastination.
I mean, it's extraordinary because they're saying that they've got this working party, but they're also saying they're waiting for EHRC guidance. Yeah. I mean, this week, John Swinney said that the ruling was complex and comprehensive. Well, you can't be both of those things.
Well, I think there was a moment as well. This is the line that now the ruling has gone from being a model of clarity and helping everyone understand to, it's quite difficult. There was a moment in the Sandy Peggy tribunal when the judge said that it was controversial or contentious. No, contentious. When it was pointed out that it mandates single-sex areas, said, well, that's a contentious point. It's not contentious. It's in the ruling. But I think, it's a problem. There are so many people lying about it.
Yeah. It's quite extraordinary, the muddle that there's been. Why in Scotland particularly?
There's going to be PhDs written about how the trans lobby captured Scotland. I go back to, I'm sure you remember the so-called Denton's report and the advice for activists that they should get into smaller countries, attach this to more popular legislation, do it under the radar. And they worked very well following that sort of guidebook in Scotland. It's also been the case that whereas in England and Wales, Stonewall didn't jump on this bandwagon until 2015, the organisations in Scotland have been pushing this since the 1990s. So it's been going for a lot longer. And then you have the added factor that Civic Scotland is very small. So if you get embedded into these circles, third sector government circles, and you become well known enough and you become respected enough, and clearly there were people who were involved in equal marriage who got a lot of respect. And if they're also then pushing this idea of self-identification, it becomes something that government ministers are more happy to listen to. Then you had Nicola Sturgeon, who took over the reins of power in 2014 from Alex Salmond, who was obviously a big personality in Scotland. He had a huge personal following, big personal constituency. She had, I think, been in his shadow, didn't have the same personal connections, and this was a way for her to differentiate herself. It was a policy that she was being told would be good by some of the younger activists in the SNP. And so I think she thought that this was a way to build a sort of brand loyalty to herself amongst that cohort. So it was a little bit of a perfect storm. There were a lot of things going on. Because it's been around for such a long time, if you go back to 2012 or 2013, as I say, which was way before Stonewall picked up on this in England and Wales, you had people from Scottish Trans Alliance writing the prison policy for them, and you had them going into the women's rape crisis centres and training them on how to include trans women. So it's gone very deep, and it's been a long time, and I think that's why it's so hard to root out.
You had a judicial review against the Scottish Government for their policy in school and in prisons, and the schools policy is now adjusted, so it's simply prisons that you're taking to court.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, we think the schools guidance is still not CAS compliant. but that's a separate point to a legal challenge based on equality legislation. But the prison guidance is awful and has always been awful. And it was a deliberate target back in 2012 because James Morton of Scottish Trans actually said we strategised that if we could persuade the prison service they could manage this, then everybody we'd be able to persuade everyone that they could manage it. And so it was very deliberate. And the other thing, of course, is that people often don't care about women in prisons. You know, even the other day, I think I saw someone on Twitter respond to a post saying, why are you bothering with them? They're criminals, without realising that, you know, women prisoners are some of the most vulnerable people, that most of them have histories of abuse, and it's very hard for them to get justice when they're in the prison. I mean, they're a walking target.
They're usually in for very different crimes to men as well, aren't they?
Absolutely. So it's an absolutely disgraceful, shameful situation that we found ourselves in. And I don't know why it is the hill so many people want to die on. The government insists that the Scottish Prison Service can manage it and have managed it. The fact is they haven't been managing it. A lot of the staff are concerned. We've heard horror stories from prisoners about what's going on right now in those prisons because of the men in those prisons. And it's absolutely shameful. It's state-sanctioned torture. They are facilitating sexual abuse and harassment in Scottish prisons today. But I think, unfortunately, there are activists as well, because I was reading a fatal accident inquiry report, and one of the things that struck me was that there are people embedded in these services who are there supposedly to promote equality and diversity, who are activists who see this as a really important plank in their strategy to get these men into these prisons and to maintain them there. But, you know, the men who are in those women's prisons now, they are dangerous, they're murderers. They are violent men, and they display all the hallmarks of violent, abusive and coercive men, and they have literally a captive group of women to practice this on.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things that you read are really horrendous. I remember a woman prisoner, I think she was an American woman, and she talked about the fact that just a man being admitted, and as he was admitted, he walked down past each cell and thumped the door. And she said for those women who had experienced domestic violence, that is terrifying. She said you couldn't sleep after that.
Yeah, yes. I mean, because we would like to be able to put in testimony from prisoners about what is happening. I don't know whether the Scottish government will try and fight that. I imagine they will. But they shouldn't, because these women's human rights matter. And you have men wandering around the showers when women are taking showers, and things like that. And as you say, when women have been subjected to violence and abuse and they see these men just taking advantage of their position of power, and they do have a position of power in the prisons, it's absolutely horrific. And I feel very angry and very strongly that we should not be experimenting on really vulnerable women like this.
Yeah. So we find out recently that the activists are not just in the prisons, they're in the government, and the government's been seeking a legal ruling called a Declaration of Incompatibility. Is this right? Does it create a discrepancy between the Supreme Court ruling and the European Convention on Human Rights? Is that how?
Well, we're trying to work out what they're trying to do because they are arguing that the men in the women's prison, their human rights will be affected if they are not allowed to be in the women's prison. Now, that makes no sense because Europe actually ruled on the case of a Polish prisoner quite recent prison. It was just that they weren't allowing him access to hormones and clothes, whatever else he wanted. And the European Court ruled in his favour, but they didn't say he should be in a women's prison. They said that could all be provided for within the men's prison. So there's no case law that establishes that male prisoners should be held in the female estate. Quite the opposite. It's a very they're trying to argue it infringes Article 3, I think, the right to a private life. Article 3 is degrading and inhuman treatment. But the people who are currently having their Article 3 rights infringed are the women, because they are being subject to degrading and inhuman treatment in those prisons. And if you carry that argument through to its logical conclusion, why is it that some of those men have that right, but others don't? And this is when you get into the whole argument the SPS seemed to think was a killer, that if they'd been convicted of violence against women, they wouldn't be held in the women's estate. We know that's not happening. We know that there is an individual in the women's estate now who has harmed a female prison guard, for example. So we know this doesn't stack up. So if you are arguing it is the human right of a man who brutally murdered another man to be in the women's prison, why isn't it the human right of Isla Bryson, who raped 2 women, to be in that prison? I don't think you can pick and choose which male who identifies as a woman you're going to allow that right. But yeah, so they have said that if all their arguments fail, they want this declaration of incompatibility. They want court to say that this is not compatible with the Human Rights Act. And of course, what that would mean would be that it would have to go back to Westminster, and Westminster would have to change the Equality Act. I cannot see, or I hope, I'm touching wood, that a court could find that the Supreme Court had disregarded human rights legislation, because the Supreme Court can't disregard human rights legislation. If the Supreme Court thought there was a conflict, they would have been obliged to address it. It's pretty bold of the Scottish Government to argue that the Supreme Court didn't understand implications under human rights.
And then this latest suggestion that we're creating a sexless class, another gender.
Again, that means that all the men who identify as women who are in the male estate, because there are more men who identify as women in male prisons in Scotland currently, thankfully. So all of them presumably are sexless, which makes no sense at all.
What doesn't make sense to me is that the Scottish Government is pushing this. It's not a vote winner.
No, it's not. And we've got an I think the thing is, we've got an election coming up in May. I think maybe they think that it's not a priority for people. I think they think that they're going to win the election regardless, that they can go into the next 4 years. I think it's a bold strategy, because going into court in February to argue for these so-called human rights of male prisoners to be locked up with vulnerable women it's a bold move ahead of an election. It's not, I don't think it's one many strategists would advise.
No, you wouldn't think so. So it's all to play for, and you're back in court on February the 3rd?
That's right, yes. Yes, so not long now.
So will the green suit be coming out again?
I think it'll have to. I think unfortunately I've painted myself into a green corner. Maybe I can find a purple one.
I think you need to. I'm going to pass you across to Bex now.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure listening to this, honestly. So we come to our final question, which we ask all of our guests, and that is, do you have a woman of the moment?
Oh, well, apart from my 2 co-directors, obviously, because they are, I suppose, everyone in Scotland, we're all hugely grateful to J.K. Rowling for everything that she has done and continues to do, and speaking out, and it has made a massive difference, I think, across the board. The women who turn out and do the stalls and come to our events and come to our rallies, and they are absolute stalwarts. And there have been a couple of them, especially, who have been really. They know why we are extremely grateful to them this year, but especially that some of the women from the Scottish Feminist Network and Women Won't Leash and the Women's Rights Network in Scotland, they have been absolute pillars of support when they were really needed this year. So I hope they all know who they are. I'll just say, Jill and Maria, hello. we love you very much. And Alan, many, many more, too many to mention, but they have been absolutely phenomenal and we are always very grateful to them, but especially this last year.
Perfect. Well, Susan, thank you so much for meeting us.
It's been so fun. Can I just say, I love these speeches at the end where people name their women, and it's turning into our like mini Oscars, isn't it?
It does feel like that, yeah.
I'm going to be in trouble because I'll have named people, and then I think there's so many others that I need to mention.
It's been such a joy, and I think we've got everything crossed for you when you're back in court in February.
Thank you.
I'm sure if it doesn't work this time, it will work again because you've done it every time, haven't you? Pulled it out of the bag.
Fingers crossed. We may have to go all the way to the Supreme Court again.
Whoa.
Yeah, we'll all be following on closely whatever happens, I'm sure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Good to chat.
Thank you to our listeners. We really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff to help keep our channel growing and spread the word. Thank you.